buddy, put that thing back in its holster. We haven't gone anywhere.
I don't understand.
Check out themichaeldukesshow.com for information on how to get access to the podcast.
The Michael Dukes Show.
I have 2 guns, one for each of you.
Firearms Friday.
As Thomas Jefferson stated, it is the right and duty of the people to be at all times armed.
Say hello to my little friend.
I say that the Second Amendment is, in order of importance, the First Amendment. The right to keep and bear arms is the one right that allows rights to exist at all.
The Michael Dukes Show. The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Firearms.
From my cold, dead hands.
Friday.
Here's my rifle, this is my gun, this is for fighting, it's for fun.
Firearms Friday.
Oh, yeah. Firearms Friday. Your chance to sound off on issues of a 2A nature. Right here on the Michael Dukes Show. Good morning and welcome to it. It is that beautiful Thursday. Technically it's Thursday, but it's kind of like a Friday. It is, for me, because, as I've been mentioning all week, I will be off tomorrow and Monday for the Memorial Day weekend. That means you will have alternate programming on both days in wherever you're listening. Could be Doug Steffen or Mike Gallagher, whoever it is that you're listening to. You are going to have alternate programming because I will be sleeping. I will be sleeping in a little bit over the weekend, enjoying a little downtime with the family. My wife has already got it all planned out. We're going to be barbecuing all weekend. We're going to be spending time with the kids. We got some new board games, one of which is absolutely hysterical. It's called Abduction, and you got little ducks that you try to get sucked up into a UFO. It's called Abduction. It is just... It's a brain teaser too, because it's a strategic kind of thing with these little ducks and this. It's so much fun. Anyway, we're going to be doing board games. We're going to hang out, enjoy some time together. We're going to watch some movies. Maybe do a little gardening around the yard to put some flowers in. I don't know what we're going to do, but it's going to be fun. And so I will not be here. Jeffrey says you're gloating about your long weekend. I'm sorry. I just don't get to take off a lot of vacation throughout the year because, the show and everything else. So I got to take my days when I can find them. And when there's already a 3-day weekend, why not tack on one more? You know what I mean? It just makes it simple and easy. That also means, of course, that since I won't be here tomorrow, today is, it's Firearms Thursday. It should be, Firearms Friday, but it's Firearms Thursday today. So we got a lot of stuff to talk about. In relation, I just couldn't let the week go without getting in some good firearms news and discussions and talking points and everything else. So we're going to do that. Also remind you that tomorrow is the final day for bidding at AlaskaRadioAuction.com. And if you haven't gone over there to take a look at all the great items that are still remaining on the auction, we've got that brand new Hughescraft boat. We've got the Arctic Cat side-by-side. We got a KTM dirt bike, a Marlin skiff, a trailer from an H&H utility trailer, a wood stove, just all kinds of stuff out there. All kinds of stuff going on out there. And that's just on the bid stuff, let alone all the instant items and everything else. So if you haven't gone over there, there's a whole bunch. If you like tools, there's a whole bunch of tools over there as well from Craig Taylor up in Fairbanks. A bunch of steel tools, STIHL steel tools. And there's even some golf clubs, if you know what I mean. There's a 5.56 golf club There's a couple of them up for auction right now, and they're a pretty darn good deal. If you haven't gone over and checked them out, go to AlaskaRadioAuction.com right now and do so. Do so. Check it out and make it happen. They will be closing those bids tomorrow at 10 a.m. roughly 10 a.m. Well, they're staggered. So tomorrow, all the bids close from starting at like 10 a.m. up until like 1 p.m. The bids kind of have a rolling close, but they're all closing down tomorrow. So go check it out. AlaskaRadioAuction.com. Coming up on today's program in hour 2. Now, we don't have any Willie Waffle because my schedule changes doesn't mean I can get him to do his, because he's a busy guy. So no Willie Waffle this week, which is it's a bummer. It's a bummer. But we are going to be joined in hour 2 by Jacob Sullum from Reason Magazine. He's coming on board to talk about his latest article. One of his latest articles. He's actually had a couple come out here. It's only 2 days ago that this article came out, and I asked him to come on. But he has an article about the New York Times and how they just keep missing the point on crime statistics and what causes what. And how they implausibly try to link certain things like looser gun laws to a homicide spike that's now receding. And this is a constant problem for people in the mainstream media. And I think that Jacob does an excellent job of actually dissecting. I mean, I wish that some of these people who do could take this kind of stuff and teach it to some of the new era of journalists, because he basically breaks down their article and the justification for their article and shows them that, they just put things in a headline and then never explain them later on. You know what I mean? They just throw stuff up there and they never justify it or explain the headline or why they say the things that they do. And I think they just think that the listeners or the reader is going to listen to them and believe it right out of the gate. Anyway, Jacob Sullum is going to be joining us in hour 2 of the program this morning, and we're going to go over that here today. All right. So what do we got? We've got a lot of stories to cover today. There's been some interesting things that have happened in just the last couple of days, including a standoff day before that was reported the day before yesterday from this last weekend in Nashville, Tennessee. We'll talk about that. There's also been the hack of a Mexican gun database, which is now showing the scope and the breadth of the repercussions from the Fast and Furious scandal. Now, you remember Fast and Furious? This was the Obama era thing. Eric Holder is the Attorney General, Barack Obama. Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. Do you remember all this? The Fast and Furious, the Gunwalker scandal. It's still got repercussions. I mean, this is like 10, 11, 12 years ago. We're still seeing parts of this. So we'll probably get inside that as well. And surprise, even Portland can't stand Portland. Even Portland can't live the continuous soft on crime lifestyle that they've been doing over the last few years. A brand new election was just held, and the prosecutor in Portland, who's been the soft on crime prosecutor, the Soros-backed district attorney, he got defeated, and not in a small way, in a big way. And it was interesting. George Soros was pouring big bucks into the campaign, and it kind of all fell apart. Again, Portland, voted to make it tougher on crime, which is just absolutely shocking and surprising as well. Plus, we got more to talk about since Alec Baldwin's case is now going to court. His attorneys have continued to throw up roadblocks in the Rust shooting case. And of course, they've been doing what attorneys are paid to do and try and find every stopgap to try and have the case dismissed multiple times to do various things. But it looks like right now that this case is now slated to go live, I think on June 19th now, I think is the new court date for this to start. June 17th, maybe. And I guess we'll see what comes out of that. But it was interesting to see what the prosecution did here in regards to being able to fight the dismissal from this case that Baldwin's attorneys had tried. And I'll be honest with you, I would like to see Alec Baldwin get some comeuppance. If nothing more, simply because he, his kind of anti-gun stance this whole time. It's kind of, it's poetic. I mean, it's tragic that Helena Hutchins died. But the poetry of somebody who was so vehemently anti-gun, but yet made a living, playing with those same guns and pretending with those same guns, and then ends up killing somebody and now is trying to justify what he was doing, kind of thing. I mean, so there's a bit of sour grapes in there and everything with that. But at the same time, I'm a little concerned about the arguments that the prosecutors made on why the case should not be dismissed. And we've talked about this on the program a little bit before, and I know some of you disagree with me on this, and so we'll get into that a little bit more up next and discuss why I think it's problematic. It's not earth-shattering. Okay, this is not an earth-shattering revelation or anything, but I think it'll give us something to talk about here this morning that is interesting and again may get a few of you to stir your coffee a little more briskly this morning as we get ready to go along. So again, it is Firearms Thursday, and we're going to be talking about firearms and guns this morning. And then, of course, Jacob Sullum from Reason Magazine will be joining us in hour 2 as well. And we're going to kick things off here in just a second. So, buttons, let's go. Let's get it going on. We'll continue with more here in just a moment. The Michael Dukes Show. Common sense, liberty-based, free-thinking radio. We'll return right after this.
Running on 100% pure beard power. Oh, also some coffee. We dip our beard in coffee.
Ha, nice beard.
The Michael Dukes Show.
Okay. Hey there, who there, hey there. Hey there. Hey there. Yeah, good morning. Good morning. Rick said, what happened to Facebook? I don't know, Rick. Facebook is up and running. In fact, Brian's back on Facebook. They let him out of jail. But it was weird. It took a long time this morning for everything to kind of launch and doing all that as well. Oh, no, Brian is back still in jail. I thought somebody said good morning, so apparently he's still in jail over on YouTube. Still doing the jail thing, he says. Still doing the jail thing. Yeah. Rick says he doesn't know what's going on. No Facebook. Although everybody else, my dad included, is over on Facebook this morning. So who knows? I mean, I didn't put the even not even the picture up on front this morning has a evil black rifle on it. So I don't know. No notification, he says. You can't I don't even know, man. I don't even know what's going on anymore. And you know what? It doesn't matter. It's Friday. It's Thursday. It's the weekend. It's the weekend. If you don't get the notification, you can always just go over to my Facebook page, and it will be running there. You could just type in the Michael Dukes Show on the top of your Facebook and the little magnifying glass there. And it should show you, if the video's live, it should show you the video as the first thing. So if you want to be on Facebook, you can jump over there. Or you can hang out with Brian because he seems sad and lonely. Seems a little sad and lonely over there. I don't know how many people are watching on. Oh, there's 9 people on Facebook. So, I mean, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. There's 9 folks out there. They're just being really quiet. Rick and Brian are the only 2 that are talking. The rest of you lurkers on Facebook, say something. Say something. It's quiet. It's probably the ATF. They're probably at their office listening to the program, waiting for me to say something that, horrible or offensive or, I don't know, something. Twitch gets no mention, man. Okay, I'm sorry, Chris. I didn't mean to. All right, there's 2 people watching on Twitch. So it's early, says Jeannie. Jeannie says, it's early. It's early. I know. Oh, Terry said that Facebook said Brian was watching this morning. Oh, well, Brian, you didn't even, man, maybe the computer is watching for you. Maybe it's there. It's there. Timothy says he was in the shower. Too much info, man. I don't need to know about your morning habits. Unless, of course, there's a waterproof radio in there and you can take me with you wherever you go. That works fine. That doesn't bother me at all. Oh, man. So. Ooh. Oh, he can watch. He just can't post. Well, that was nice of them. At least you get a chance to watch. You just can't participate. Bad Brian. No donut. No donut for you. You can watch, but you're like that kid on the outside of the glass. You see all the other kids with the toys inside, and you can't do anything about it. Okay. So I think we're going to take this Rust thing on to begin with, just because it's interesting. And we'll I'll give you my thoughts on it. You guys can tell me if you think I'm wrong or not. You're crazy. You're crazy. By the way, have you gone over and looked at AlaskaRadioAuction.com and looked at the golf clubs there? The golf clubs that are up and available from Arctic Ammo. It's there's some good deals there. You may want to go check it out. All right. 10 seconds. Let's get to it. If you need a new set of clubs, there's no better place to go right now. Let's do it. Here we go.
What the hell's an assault weapon?
If we could just figure out how to get all of the murder guns and the attack guns and not keep selling those to people and just sell protection guns, I think that would be great and solve a lot of problems.
Does this mean that if we hurt your feelings, you'd consider the Michael Dukes Show assault radio? Okay, we can live with that. Here's Michael Dukes.
I mean, it doesn't even hurt my feelings that your feelings are hurt at this point. I mean, that's just how it works. Jeannie just Jeannie just said she watches the show on YouTube on her 65-inch television and then comments on her phone on Facebook. And then she just said, his head is huge. I don't have a 4-head. I have like a 6-head, okay? You can blame, I don't know, genetics or whatever. My hairline has been dropping back the last few years. Just keep threatening my wife I'm going to do a Jean-Luc Picard and just shave the whole thing down. See what we do there. Anyway, I would do that, but I would probably scare the dogs. You guys are vicious this morning. The chat room, I feel attacked. The chat room is a little vicious this morning. Little self-conscious about the size of my noggin. Anyway, welcome back. It's Thursday. We're having a good time today, in case you couldn't tell. It's Firearms Thursday instead of Firearms Friday today because we'll be off for tomorrow and Monday. But before we went to break, we started talking about this big thing, which is making headlines and has made headlines around the country. And that, of course, is the accidental shooting or negligent shooting, I guess we could say, of the film producer and director of photography, Helena Hutchins, on the set of the movie Rust, which, as you know, is, of course, Alec Baldwin's movie that he produced, he starred in, he helped write this whole thing. And he's obviously in hot water. Now, the armorer, Hannah Gutierrez Reed, you'll remember this, and I watched quite a bit of this trial because it was of interest to me because of the ramifications about the firearm itself and some of the stuff surrounding it. I just found it fascinating. I'm not usually much of a court TV kind of person, but my wife, she loves to watch all the different court cases and stuff like that. But we watched quite a bit of the Gutierrez Reed trial, and they found her guilty of negligence and everything else. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison over that one. And yet she wasn't the one that pulled the trigger. Alec Baldwin pulled the trigger. Now, it's going to be interesting to find if he has any culpability, either A, as the person who had the gun and pulled the trigger specifically, although he claims he didn't. The FBI disagreed, by the way. All the testimony from the experts at the FBI and the ATF who tested the firearm said that there is absolutely, they attempted to, because he said, it just went off. That's what he said. It just went off. I didn't pull the trigger. They took it into the lab and they could not make it just go off. They did everything. They could just not make it just go off. So that is kind of a DOA course of action for the defense team from Alec Baldwin. He could say it in the news media all he wants, but in the court of law, that's not a justifiable defense because they've already proven that to be inaccurate. So anyway, he's facing a trial of his own, and his attorneys are doing what attorneys are paid to do. They're trying to get the whole thing thrown out. They're trying to get it dismissed. And so when they file for a dismissal like that, the prosecution has to come back with a rebuttal, and they have to show that there was a valid reason for the trial to continue. And they did. Now, again, as much as I kind of feel a little vindication that Alec Baldwin has to face some charges on this, because and I would be lying if I didn't say I feel a little vindictive about this, because he has been so vocal about how much he dislikes gun ownership and how it should all be illegal and everything else, and the hypocrisy of this guy who throughout the years has been in movies and other things where he utilizes those guns to then, pretend and make a living, right? It's the same thing like Liam Neeson, who, kills 87 people in the Taken movie with guns and everything, but then says, in real life, we shouldn't be allowed to do anything with it. It's just kind of it's a type of hypocrisy that just bothers me when that kind of stuff goes on. But here's what happened. Here's what the prosecutors said when Baldwin's team tried to get the case dismissed from the Blast.com On May 22nd, state prosecutors filed another response to Alec Baldwin's attempt to get the case thrown out. In court documents obtained by The Blast, the state of New Mexico filed a response to his motion to dismiss for failure to allege a criminal offense. In the filing, prosecutors alleged that Baldwin, quote, violated decades-old gun safety and set safety standards by pointing the gun at a person, cocking it, and pulling the trigger. This is especially egregious given that the rehearsal blocking did not call for the actor to do any of these things. It goes on to say, it is a substantial and unjustifiable risk to point a real gun at another human being, cock it, and pull the trigger under nearly all circumstances, but certainly so where the gun handler did not participate in the loading of the gun and determined with certainty that all rounds were inert ensured that all 6 chambers of the revolver were empty, unquote. The prosecutors assert that the facts of the case are simple, adding guns kill, and everyone, including Mr. Baldwin, knows it. Well, guns don't kill, people kill. But you get the point here. Now, interestingly enough, I don't think, and this is where we got into a bit of a tussle last time when we were discussing this, is that I am, I guess I would say that there are certain things that I'm not an absolutist on. And part of that is this discussion of you violated gun safety rules, pointing a gun at a person, cocking it, pulling the trigger. Those are rules that should never be broken. In real life, you are 100% correct. Now, what would cause us to violate those decades-old gun safety rules? Well, in the case of defending yourself against an attacker, you have violated all of those rules, right? You have pointed a gun at a person, you've cocked it, and you're pulling the trigger. That is technically a violation of all those rules. Now, with good reason, right? With good reason. Now, I would argue that in the case of a movie set and a movie that is make-believe, you could argue that that is also an exception to those rules. But again, that's why they have all those safety standards. It's why they have on-set armorers. It's why they have all those things, because you are going to intentionally break those rules for the sake of theater, for the sake of make-believe, to make it look good, right? The Dirty Harry, Make My Day, where he's backlit by the sun and you're looking down the tremendous tunnel of a 44 Magnum, that shot obviously would have violated, because there's a cameraman operating that camera, and if you can see down the throat of that 44 Magnum, he's pointing it right at you, right? So we are violating those rules, but we're doing it at that point with cause, with understanding, and hopefully, in most cases, with the utmost safety and concern in mind. See, here's part of the problem. Alec Baldwin has such a disdain for firearms that I think that kind of attitude kind of runs through everything that's going on here. Somebody who has a respect for firearms, who has a history of actually using them, respects them in their real life. They treat each time they take a firearm out or carry a firearm or use a firearm, they treat it with the respect, and they follow those 4 gun safety rules and everything else. When they get into a situation where, in this case, like they have to pretend, like, for example, Keanu Reeves. Keanu Reeves is not just an actor who shoots toy guns. He has trained extensively with real firearms. If you've ever seen him on the range, and there are several videos of him out there doing 3-gun and with live fire and everything else, he is the consummate professional shooter. If you treat them with respect in real life and respect the potential with him in real life, I think when it comes down to the playtime, you'll see that kind of carry over, and you won't treat it as an afterthought because you understand how dangerous and how powerful they are. Because Alec Baldwin disdains firearms in real life and just thinks that nobody should have them, he doesn't really think about the safety rules. He just assumes everything's going to be fine and everything else. And then you hire, and there's a lot of backstory here, folks, about Gutierrez Reed. This was her second movie as being an armorer, but she wasn't just the armorer. They put other duties on top of her. When an armorer is supposed to be just an armorer, that's what they're supposed to do. One job. Your one job is to track all this stuff. But they just heaped other jobs on her and did all this stuff. And then the director, David Hall, the second AD or whatever, he was heaping stuff on her and then taking part of her responsibility. And it was a mess. But I think this just comes from the disdain. In part, it comes from the disdain that Baldwin had for firearms. Oh, we don't need an armor. Firearms are dumb, but we're going to use them. But we don't really, I think that's part of it. But the idea that they're going to try and prosecute the case based on decades-old gun safety and set safety standards by pointing a gun at a person, cocking it, and pulling the trigger, that's in and of itself, I don't think that would be enough. Now, interestingly enough, they continue to say this is especially egregious given that the rehearsal/blocking did not call for the actor to do any of these things. It might have been different if the rehearsal shot had called for Baldwin to point the gun at the camera and pull the trigger. But Baldwin was, at that point, he would have been doing something that he was supposed to do. But it turns out that he was just playing around with the gun, making things up as he went along. Again, I just think it's problematic to say you didn't follow the gun safety rules, because there are times where we do violate those safety rules. In the case of defense of ourselves, or in the case of controlled circumstances for promotional material, for make-believe, right? Marketing stuff where you're shooting video or whatever for commercials, movies, TVs, magazine articles, whatever, people are downrange of the barrel. And that all happens, but that has to happen in a controlled environment. And when you disrespect the gun from the very beginning and don't believe people should have them, that kind of attitude kind of carries over into your safety methodology as well. And I think that's what happened here. He has no respect for the power of the firearm, treated it like a toy, hired some young girl who didn't have enough knowledge, or she had knowledge, but she didn't have the backbone to stand up to David Hall or Alec Baldwin. David Hall was the AD and Alec Baldwin is the producer, to stand up and say, you guys we're not doing this. She could have shut the whole set down. Whenever they saw a violation, the armorer has the power to stop everything cold in its tracks. If she sees something wrong, she, even more than the director, has the power to shut the whole thing down. But she was young and inexperienced and did not feel like she had that authority or that power. If they had put an experienced armorer in that position, and they tried to get a couple other armorers, and neither one of them would stick around. Apparently, it was kind of a poo parade. But an armorer has the authority, because it's about the safety of everyone on set, to shut that thing down. And so he got himself a cut rate armorer because he really doesn't care about guns. And that kind of travels over to he really doesn't care about gun safety. And now someone is dead. And I think he should pay for that negligence. Not necessarily, I'm not saying that he, that again, with malice aforethought or anything else, but that negligence, there should be a cost with that. because you had every opportunity to stop it along the way. But to say that he should be prosecuted because he violated gun safety rules, this is a situation where those safety rules historically have been violated and can be violated, but with precautions, right? Otherwise, I just don't want to see somebody else be prosecuted because they defended themselves in a situation, and then somebody comes back and say, well, you violated gun safety rules by pointing the gun at the person, cocking it, and pulling the trigger. Well, yes, they were trying to kill me. I just don't want to see that, right? Anyway, this Roll Rust thing is going to be fascinating to watch. It'll be the must-see TV of the summer in my household anyway, to see what happens there. It'll be interesting. All right, we got to go. We're going to be back in just a moment. I'm going to see if the chat room is blowing up at me or not. Then when we get back, we've got some other discussions, including some lessons learned from a church in Nashville, Tennessee. We'll be back with more. The Michael Duke Show. Common sense, liberty-based, free-thinking radio.
What is that?
Common sense. Regularly heard on American radio. Michael Duke Show. Radio.
Okay. What do we got here? Go back up here to what you guys have been saying here. Actually, let me just sending a text message to Jacob Sullum to make sure that he's got the link for this morning's show. Didn't they actually break the gun in testing? They actually did. They attempted to get it to fire by basically putting it in a bench rest or vise and trying to whack it in various ways to try and get the trigger to release. They cocked it and then they did it, and they ended up whacking it hard enough on the hammer that they actually broke the hammer off. It never fired. It's an interesting thing. Never fired. Yeah. There was a post utilized right after it happened, and it was taken down. The Thing director said, we got to take another shot. And Alec Baldwin said, why don't I take a shot at you? Pull the trigger. Oh, it was taken down in an hour. The director said, we got to take another shot. And Alec said, why don't I take a shot at you and pull the trigger? Oh, well, I didn't see that. Yeah, that's an interesting thing. That's an interesting thing for sure. All right. Joe Navas, only in a safe direction. Is it not on camera? Well, again, there are rules and then there are exceptions to the rules. And supposedly on a cold set, that would be a valid exception to the rule. This was the perfect, set of circumstances that came together for this to happen. Richard asked, do assault penguins taste like chicken? Yes, they are delicious. They are delicious. How does the end of a blank round look different from the back end of a real casing of a real bullet? If you flip open the cylinder of the revolver, can you see a glance? Can you see that it was loaded with blanks? The blanks that they were using were actually cartridges that had been drilled on the side. So if you just hold it in your hand, it looks like a regular cartridge. It's got a round projectile. It's got the primer in the back and everything else. But along the side of the cases have been drilled with holes, and usually they put BBs in them. So you rattle it and it's a dead round. It's a dummy round, right? So that's because in the 6-shooters, when you're looking at it from a camera angle on and you're looking at the front of the cylinder, you can actually see the bullets in the cylinder. A blank is crimped on the end. It's like it's usually crimped closed on the end. And so you could tell if you had a cylinder full of blanks in a 6-shooter, you could see the crimps on the end of the cylinders and you would know that they're blanks. So they use these dummy rounds that, again, have a real projectile on one end, have the primer on the other end. They're usually dud primers, and then they're drilled on the side. There's no powder in them. They put a BB in them so they could shake them. But this equipment was so bad, half the ones that they shook, even though they had holes drilled on the side, the BB was kind of stuck in them. It was not a high quality setup on the set for the armorer. Let's just put it that way. There's a lot of stuff involved in that. And all this stuff came out during the Gutierrez trial. The operative phrase, Brian says, in that whole thing is controlled circumstances. And I would argue that the set of Rust was definitely not a controlled circumstance for a variety of reasons. Number one, they didn't have an armorer that had enough experience to take control of the situation. You had Baldwin, who is supposedly very tyrannical in these kind of things, yelling at people's on set and things like that as a producer, basically chivying people and getting them to hurry and cut corners, plus his disdain for firearms and everything else, and not respecting the role of the armorer as well. Robert says, never should have had live rounds at the site. I 100% agree. There shouldn't have been a live round within 10 miles of that picture. And that was part of the problem. They were going out there and shooting the same guns they were using on set with live rounds. They were target practicing when the cameras weren't rolling. I mean, it was a mess. Yeah, it was a mess. So anyway, it was definitely a perfect storm of circumstances there. And in the end, somebody lost their life. And I think that somebody needs to, what the dude, block user, delete comment. There we go. Look at that. Okay, we're coming back to it. The Michael Duke Show, common sense, liberty-based, free thinking radio. Like, share, subscribe, ring the bell. Let's do this thing.
What the hell is an assault weapon? Does that mean that if we hurt your feelings, you should consider the Michael Dukes Show assault radio? Okay, we can accept that. Here's Michael Dukes. Kind of a dick, but somewhat funny.
That's kind of hurtful, man. That's kind of hurtful. I mean, kind of a... Anyway, welcome back to the program. People in the chat room are actually agreeing with me on this one. And it was a mess of what's going on. This is just, again, the perfect circumstances for something like this to happen. And it was all preventable. That's the worst part, is it's preventable. Just like many negligent discharges in out there in the real world, most of which are preventable. And it has to do with the lack of respect for something that can kill you. And it's one of the reasons why I think that there should be gun safety courses taught in all schools. Now, do we mandate it? Well, no, but make it available anyway. How many times have kids, found guns or done something like that and accidentally, shot one of their fellows because they came across it and they don't understand the gun safety rules, and they've played Call of Duty or they've seen it on TV and they think it's cool, and then somebody gets hurt or killed because they don't understand the gun safety rules. Well, we shouldn't teach Johnny the gun safety rules because it's that's evil. Guns are evil, and we shouldn't teach him the safety rules. It might interest him. He might develop an interest in the evil guns. Well, he might learn something, and maybe it could save his life or the life of somebody else. It's Oh, it's so frustrating to see. People in the chat room are saying he needs to be held accountable to his actions. You know, he pulled the trigger, yada, yada, yada. Again, I agree. And I think he's trying to get out of it. And again, this all stems, in my opinion, from his absolute disdain for fire. He sees them as nothing more than a prop for him to make money with. He can't understand other people who, who might have another reason to carry a firearm or to have firearms, and he has disdain for them, and therefore that disdain carries over into things like gun safety and everything else. It is what it is. There you go. Layla in the chat room says, I think the Alec Baldwin trial should be televised. It will be. It will be televised. Court TV was in the Gutierrez trial, and this one will be televised as well. She said it could be the best pro-gun safety lesson ever, and all the anti-gun crowd could tune in because they think Alec Baldwin is being mistreated. I know a lot of people who got a good gun education because they tuned into the Rittenhouse trial thinking the experts would vindicate their belief that Rittenhouse was everything they believed he was, and seeing the trial changed their minds. That was ordinary people. And the ones who tune into Alec Baldwin, they'll get I would agree. They may get a whole new education on that. The Rittenhouse trial was fascinating. I did not watch a lot of it, but the few of the pieces and the clips that I watched on the video, it was very interesting to watch, and totally flew against the narrative of what the mainstream media was trying to portray on Kyle Rittenhouse. It's yeah. All right. What else we got here? Lessons learned from this last weekend in Tennessee. Police in Nashville are looking for a man they say fired a shot in a church parking lot on Saturday night before fleeing after an armed parishioner drew their own gun. It happened at the Catholic Church Our Lady of Guadalupe, where a group of parishioners were directing traffic when a stranger showed up. The volunteers were helping direct traffic for the evening mass at the church when they saw a man walking his dog on Sunrise Avenue towards Nolensville Pike. The volunteers told police that as he walked by, he yelled obscenities at them. So he's walking his dog, sees people in the church parking lot directing traffic, starts throwing curses at them and obscenities. Then, while still in the roadway, the man allegedly removed a holstered pistol and fired a shot into the ground. Okay. In response, one of the volunteers pulled out his own firearm and discharged a round into the pavement, causing the man to run away. The man is believed to live in the immediate area and has been seen walking on prior evenings. They said the motive for confronting the volunteers at the church has not been determined. Okay, so lessons learned here. First and foremost, don't ever shoot into the pavement, okay? Shooting into the pavement is asking for a ricochet, and you have no idea and have no concept of where that bullet could possibly go. Why would you fire a warning shot in that response? In this case specifically, somebody has already fired at you or into the ground and has their firearm there and ready. Seeking cover would be good. And if you felt that your life was in jeopardy at that point, it's center of mass. It's not pulling a trigger and pointing at the ground and pulling the trigger and hoping that the bullet does not go somewhere and splatter some small child or adult or some innocent bystander with the ricochet. So that's first and foremost. Now, and also firing a warning shot in some jurisdictions is not allowed. You will go to jail for firing a warning shot. And I think for the reasons that we just talked about, whether it's up in the air and you have no idea where it's going to come down, or you shoot it into the pavement and it ricochets off somewhere, that's obviously a problem. But the lesson here is, were they in danger? I would say if somebody pulled a gun and shot into the pavement in my direction or near me, the answer is yes. Can I seek cover? Yes or no? Should I defend somebody else? Is he a danger not just to me, but to those around me? You're in a parking lot. You're helping people get... If the answer is yes, again, it's center of mass. Because at that point, it's not just about you. It's about every parishioner that's around you, people who are in their cars and still have no idea what's going on. This person is willing, obviously, to draw a gun and fire around. That's just, trading warning shots is not helping anybody at that point. So it was an interesting situation. They're still looking for him. He obviously lives around there, like they said, and I think once they do find him, it'll be interesting to see what the reaction and the reasoning was behind it. I wanted to get to this before the end of the show, and I just realized we're running out of time here. District Attorney Mike Schmidt, who is the progressive attorney for Portland, Oregon, he now is going to need to seek employment elsewhere. On Tuesday night, the voters of Multnomah County fired the one-term Soros-backed incumbent. The race was 58% to 42% for his opponent, Nathan Vasquez. And even the people in Portland, progressive, let's burn the world down, let's burn our own city down, Portland, couldn't take another term of the guy who was so soft on crime that it has led to the deterioration of downtown Portland, which has become overrun with homelessness and drugs. Since he won the election in 2020, he has been criticized by everyone from the union that represents prosecutors to everybody in his staff to, well, all the people who complain that he's been soft on crime and that Portland has basically been falling apart ever since. Even Portland couldn't reelect this guy. This is good news, well, for gun owners and for everybody else. It's good news all the way around. With killings, riotings, and drug ODs on the rise and the destruction of downtown Portland have been going on for the last 4 years, he's out. DA Mike Schmidt out the door. Well, again, there's no atheist in a foxhole. They finally discover that they get everything they ever wanted. They discovered they probably didn't want what they'd been wishing for. All right, we got to go. Jacob Sullum from Reason Magazine's up next. The Michael Duke Show. Common sense, liberty-based, free-thinking radio. Are we getting 2 Firearms Fridays today on Thursday? You're getting, I don't know what you mean, Henry. You're getting 1 Firearms Thursday. That's what you're getting. Yeah. I mean, I'm glad nothing happened in this Tennessee shooting. I do not understand this whole concept of shooting into the ground unless he accidentally shot into the ground in his haste to try and draw his firearm. But if somebody pulls a gun and shoots it while yelling at me, I feel threatened at that point. I mean, I feel threatened. If you've been yelling obscenities at me and shaking your fist and everything else, and then you draw a firearm and shoot it into the ground or anywhere else, I mean, let's face it, if you draw a firearm while you're yelling obscenities at me, I feel threatened. Wait. Don't lump atheists and liberals together. What? What did I say? How did I lump atheist sourdough steel over? Says, whoa, don't lump atheists and liberals together. I don't, I didn't know I did, but, yeah. GD, who's from the area down there in that Washington, Oregon kind of zone, says, keep in mind, Schmidt is one of 3 county prosecutors. There are Clackamas and Washington county prosecutors yet to unseat as well. Yeah. Yeah. Greg says, sounds like the parishioners need some Donna Anthony church security training. I would agree. I think it's time to bring Donna Anthony back. Maybe they should bring her down there and let her do some church security, active shooter training down there. Because, yeah, this idea of warning shots. By the time I have decided to utilize my firearm, there is no warning shots, because it's a big leap from something may be going wrong to have actually drawn my firearm from its holster. At that point, I'm pretty committed. I'm pretty committed to some course of action at that point. I would never draw it unless there was really some course of action right there in front of me. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. All right. We're getting ready. Let me see. Did I miss any other commentary here? Before I go to it here, we're about 3 minutes from rejoining the radio, and I see that Jacob Sullum has just hit the green room. He's getting his studio area there all set up. So we'll let Jacob get all set up there as he's getting all his lighting and everything squared away. I'm just scrolling backwards to see if there was anything that I missed. Richard Allen says, well, according to Alec Baldwin, in typical liberal fashion, it was anyone else's fault but his, not being vindictive. Richard said he's not being vindictive. However, it would be good to see him receive a punishment that he just can't throw money at. Again, I don't know necessarily that I want to be vindictive enough to see him get, I want to see somebody held responsible for the laxities and for the disregard that they had on the set for all the procedures that were supposed to be followed. They shortcutted everything. Came out in the Gutierrez Reed trial. They shortcutted everything. I mean, there were so many instances where she was passed over and given no authority to make the changes that needed to happen. An armorer, again, should be the only person on the set, second only unto the director, and she can override the director or the producer on the safety on the set to call a shutdown. The armorer in every other movie, in every other shoot, have that authority. They can override everybody up to the president of the company on whether or not the shoot can proceed because of a safety issue. She just did not have the experience. She was doing double duty. She was, again, she was inexperienced. It was the perfect storm of things. But that's because, again, Baldwin cut corners at every opportunity and has no respect for firearms. And so therefore had no respect for firearms safety or anything else. All right. I see Jacob Sullum is now ready. Let me go over there. We will check his audio, make sure everything's good to go, see if he's comfortable, got his cup of coffee, and good. Hello, my friend. How are you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Look at you. You sound great. You look great. You ready for the weekend? Are you taking a long weekend?
It's actually our youngest daughter's high school graduation.
Oh, wow.
Week. So we're going up to Frisco for that. Her high school is in Plano, but they are doing, I think, all 3 high schools from the district together at once. So it's going to be many, many kids.
Oh, you'll be sitting through 1,000 names.
So they needed a special venue in Frisco. Yeah, it'll be fun.
Oh, it'll be fun. I love the enthusiasm. It'll be fun. All right. Well, we're ready to go here, my friend. We're going to jump into this, and as soon as we do the intro, we'll be right back to you. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Hold the line. We're talking with Jacob Sullum, Reason Magazine, our guest, and we're going to dive into this piece that he wrote here this week about the New York Times and the crime stat. Nothing bothers me more, and I'll talk about this when we come back to it. Nothing bothers me more than, putting something in a headline or a subheading that blames one thing or another and then never backing it up in the article. And it happens more and more these days. We talked about this here a couple weeks ago about that other article. I can't even remember. I don't have time to remember at this point. We're going to be back. Don't go anywhere. The Michael Duke Show, Common Sense Radio. Here we go.
Whoa, buddy. Put that thing back in its holster. We haven't gone anywhere.
I don't understand.
Check out themichaeldukesshow.com for information on how to get access to the podcast.
The Michael Duke Show.
I have 2 guns, one for each of you.
Firearms Friday.
As Thomas Jefferson stated, it is the right and duty of the people to be at all times armed.
Say hello to my little friend.
I say that the Second Amendment is, in order of importance, the First Amendment. The right to keep and bear arms is the one right that allows rights to exist at all.
The Michael Duke Show. The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Firearms.
From my cold, dead hands.
Friday.
Here's my rifle, this is my gun. This is for riding, it's for fun.
Firearms Friday.
Firearms Friday, your chance to sound off on issues of a 2A nature. It's actually Thursday, but since I'm going to be on vacation tomorrow and Monday, I just couldn't let the week go without doing a whole show on firearms because it's my therapy. I needed my weekly therapy, right? I mean, otherwise I get a little cranky, a little grouchy. So it's technically Firearms Thursday, and that's okay. We're going to do that today. We just finished up talking about a bunch of stories from around the country, but coming up now is Jacob Sullum from Reason Magazine. Jacob has been a guest on the show quite frequently. He is a senior editor over at Reason, and he writes a lot of good stuff and a lot of good stuff about firearms specifically as well. And I wanted to talk to him about his piece here from this week that's titled "The New York Times Implausibly Blames Looser Gun Laws for a Homicide Spike That's Now Receding." And again, this is part of a deeper problem. I covered this last week, where there was an article in the Scripps News Service, which again, Scripps, like the AP, feeds a lot of newspapers and outlets around the country. Scripps is like an outlet for newspapers to pull from. And there was an article from Jennifer Glenfield back on the 15th, where she asked, the headline reads, "Why are there fewer federal gun control laws today than before?" And that question, it's false. There are not fewer federal gun laws today than before. There are, continually more. Yet this is the headline. Nobody ever bothers to dig deeper on it. You don't have real journalists like Jacob Sullum who actually pick this kind of stuff apart and say, well, you say this in the headline. Is it really true? Let's present both sides of it. And this is going on more and more. So Jacob's new article, again, the New York Times implausibly blames looser gun laws for a homicide spike that is now receding. Let's get the hot take here from Jacob Sullum over at Reason Magazine as he joins us right now. Good morning, Jacob. How are you, my friend?
Good morning. I'm okay. How are you?
Good. I'm doing good. It's my Friday, so I'm feeling pretty good. I get that 4-day weekend. You, unfortunately, have got to sit through a lot of graduating stuff and everything, which is always, it makes you proud, but it does take some time. So I hope you have I'm
going to have to bring a flask.
Yes, hey, there's always the emergency flask. That's always in the hip pocket somewhere. I've got my bug out bag. What's the most important thing? The emergency flask. That's the most important thing for sure. Jacob, I was just talking, and I don't know if you saw this article, but it seems to be happening more and more. You're talking about the New York Times article where they talk about how looser gun laws, created this homicide spike, but yet they provide no evidence of it. And this happens more and more. This other article from Scripps where, why are there fewer federal gun control laws? And they act like it's a statement of fact, and yet they never back it up later on in the article. Is this just lazy journalism? Is it intentional? Is it them trying to mislead people, knowing that people will not read beyond the first headline, the subheadline, and the first two paragraphs? Before we get into the heart of the article, what are your thoughts on that? Because that seems to be happening more and more.
Well, I think reporters come to these stories with certain assumptions, and they may have a thesis that they want to prove because it fits with their pre-existing policy preferences. And then in doing the research of the story, they may not notice that they have failed to validate their hypothesis, and they go ahead and run the story with the spin they had in mind anyway. I think that's basically what happens. This was a compelling angle for New York Times reporters and editors. They thought it would be compelling for their readers. It fits with the general complaint that gun control is too weak, that the Supreme Court is making it even weaker. And of course, we did have a spike in homicides during the pandemic. And surely, one thing has something to do with the other, but in fact, they don't present any evidence to make that connection.
Right. Well, and you start off the story, you start off the analysis of the story, because you're not writing a story here. You're actually looking at the facts of the case, and they make the first argument that this is true by pointing to a case that happened in June of 2021, where Jason Keyes was killed during a dispute in a neighborhood of Columbus, and yet that example there fails to do exactly what they're pointing to in the headlines. It has nothing to do with looser gun laws. Walk us through it.
Yeah, so this is the case that they open the story with, and they come back to it at the end. So the whole story is framed around this incident, and the implication is that this crime is emblematic of how weak gun laws have helped foster murder, gun homicides in Columbus. But then when you look at what actually happened, and you look at the changes in gun policy that they're citing, the changes are totally irrelevant. They don't. There's not even an arguably plausible connection. So what happened in this case? It's a really sort of bizarre altercation. Keyes and his wife were visiting her grandparents on Father's Day. As they were leaving, they were accosted by one of the neighbors, a 72-year-old man who was holding a rifle. And he was convinced that Keyes had let the air out of his daughter's tires and put herbicide on his lawn. So it was a tense.
We're like, what?
So this is kind of a tense confrontation, and Keyes had a pistol in his waistband. So they both were armed. According to police and prosecutors, basically the situation had been diffused at the point where another neighbor, a 24-year-old ex-Marine, went out onto his porch and fired 7 rounds from his rifle, and he killed Keyes. So it wasn't even the guy who initially confronted him who ended up killing him. So that's pretty weird. And what happened with that case is that the shooter went to trial. He argued that he was acting in defense of himself and his neighbors. The jury didn't buy it. He was convicted of murder. He got a life sentence, although potentially he could get out earlier with on parole. And that hinged on, did he reasonably believe that the use of deadly force was necessary to defend himself or others? And it's hard to see how that could have been the case. The jury didn't believe it, but according to the way the prosecutors told it, he basically was escalating a situation that had already been essentially resolved and diffused.
Right.
So that's the case. So what do Ohio gun laws have to do with this, you might ask? So
right.
The Times notes that that same year, April of that year, a new law took effect that changed the rules for armed self-defense by eliminating the duty to retreat, which already did not apply in people's homes and didn't apply in their vehicles, right? That was the existing law, but they eliminated the duty to retreat for other places as well. As long as, if you're in public in a place where you're allowed to be, and you're confronted by a potentially deadly threat, you're not obligated to look to see, is there some way I can run away or escape? Now, that's totally irrelevant to this case, right? This guy was standing on his own porch, right? So that would have been covered under the pre-existing law. Had he been, had he actually used a gun in self-defense, it would have been covered under the pre-existing law. And as the jury found, he did not use the gun in self-defense. So it had nothing to do with it. Then the Times cites some changes that were made, first of all, after this murder. So logically speaking, unless there's some kind of time machine involved, it's impossible that anything done after the murder could have contributed to the murder.
And they don't point that out, by the way. They don't point out that it was done after the murder. You had to know when the law was passed. This is, again, lazy journalism.
I think they might have cited the year when the law was passed, but they didn't note the implication, right? And I'll just give you, they noted a few changes, but one of them was letting teachers be armed if they go through a training course. Obviously has nothing to do with this case. And they mentioned eliminating the permit requirement for concealed carry. Has nothing to do with this case.
Right.
The guy he was carrying openly on his own property. Has nothing to do with concealed carry permits. And as I said, even if this were arguably related, it happened afterward. Then they reach further back in the past and they say, well, I believe it was in 2006, Ohio passed a law that preempted local gun control ordinances.
Right. States
and all right. So what did that mean in practice? Well, they say, well, Columbus wanted to ban so-called high-capacity magazines, defined as, in this case, as more than 30 rounds, which is generous, compared to the laws in a bunch of states. More generous than 10, that's for sure. And they also passed an ordinance requiring safe storage of guns so that kids can't have access to them.
Right.
Both of those were blocked by litigation based on this state law that says they're preempted. But first of all, both of those were passed after this murder, right? So obviously have nothing to do with it. And then you think about it, well, this guy who committed the murder was not a kid, so he's an adult. So the safe storage law has nothing to do with it. What about a ban on magazines holding more than 30 rounds? Well, the guy fired 7 rounds. So even if you can use time even if you use a time travel machine, it's not possible, even theoretically, that this would have had any impact.
Yeah.
And then the last thing they cite is that in 2014, the state repealed a similar ban limit on magazine capacity, which again, it's not relevant given the number of rounds fired. And more generally, when they talk about gun violence in Columbus, they emphasize these cases where teenagers get into these petty disputes and it escalates to deadly violence. And safe storage might have something to do with that, right? That's at least arguably relevant. But whether you need a permit to carry concealed obviously has nothing to do with that. The limits on magazine capacity almost never have anything to do with these cases because they're not involving people firing more than 30 rounds.
Right.
Right. So it's basically starting with the thesis that weak gun control is responsible for this, and then saying, well, here, the murders went up. Also, you have these changes that were made, and no attempt to even try to logically connect these things.
Right.
And you need at least some kind of plausible theory of why these laws could have made a difference, even if they don't in the case they highlight, which is weird, by the way, because they could have picked any case they wanted, right? They could have picked a case that was more arguably related to gun control in some way, but this one is totally unrelated to anything they talk about. Oh, the other thing I forgot to mention, they emphasize that the murderer's rifle was one that he assembled at home through parts that he bought. So it was a ghost gun. What does that have to do with this murder, right?
Right.
If he had just bought a ready-made gun, the guy his victim would be equally dead, right? It's just complete. So it's lots of red herrings.
Right.
These are things that are happening in the world that we don't like vis-a-vis guns. These are laws we don't like. We also don't like murder. These two things must be related in some way.
Right.
So the other thing so they're trying to say that this spike in homicides in Columbus had something to do with lack of gun control. But of course, the whole country saw a spike in homicides during the pandemic, many cities. It's true that in 2023, murders generally went down, did not go down in Columbus. That was also true, by the way, I think in Dallas and a few other cities where they bucked that trend. But this year, so far this year, it looks like there's a sharp decline in homicides in Columbus as well as these other cities. Columbus has not, neither Ohio nor Columbus has imposed new gun control to try to bring down murders. So that they want to say, and in fact, they explicitly say is, we're really worried that even though it seems like the homicide rate is going back down again, that somehow that will be stopped or halted because there's not strict enough gun control.
Right.
And yet the facts that they present show you that it's going down sharply and nothing has changed of any relevance in terms of gun control.
And again, it kind of blows your whole headline right out of the water again. Wait,
right.
I mean,
and so I try to be fair-minded about these things. I'm reading the article and I'm just waiting for some kind of, not even evidence, but in some sort of intelligible hypothesis. When a scientist does a study, they're like, okay, here's what we think might be the case. We think that this, variable A might be related to B, and here's why we think that. This is why it's plausible to think that. Then they go and do the study and see where they actually related. So the Times not only didn't do the study where they tried to find evidence, they didn't even formulate a testable hypothesis involving some kind of plausible causal connection.
Right. Jacob Sullum, Reason Magazine, is our guest. Jacob, hold the line for just a sec, folks. We gotta take a quick break. When we come back, we'll continue this discussion, and I think I want to dive a little bit more as a journalist into this. Again, going back to this idea of coming forward with a hypothesis, and then ignoring all the facts that are around it, or failing to create connectors to your argument. This seems to be the new standard for journalists in major news outlets across the country. We'll talk about that as well, and other firearms news with Jacob Sullum, senior editor, Reason Magazine, The Michael Duke Show. Common sense, liberty-based, free-thinking radio.
Running on 100% pure beard power. Oh, also some coffee. We dip our beard in coffee.
Ha, nice beard.
The Michael Duke Show.
Jacob Sullum, Reason Magazine, our guest on this. I went through and read this article after catching the headline and everything, and then came back and read your article afterwards, and I'm just aghast because it's gone beyond the idea of lazy journalism into its advocacy. It's propagandizing. It's just willful blindness on the part of many of these modern day journalists and again, I don't know if you caught this Scripps news story from Jennifer Glenfield. I mean, the first time I read it, I thought, is this actually a real person, or is this, because, everybody's talking about these new AI articles, right? I mean, Rolling Stones had a fictitious journalist, that was writing stuff. And I thought, is this a real person? And sure enough, it is. I tracked it down. But this idea that we can just say one thing in the headlines, like, why are there fewer federal gun control laws today than ever before? And then look at the article and say, okay, show us how that, show us where that actually happens. And there's absolutely nothing in there. It's just an assumption. And it really is, I think is really contributing to the decline in the confidence in journalism in the country, Jacob, quite honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I have no problem with advocacy journalism. That's pretty much what I do. But it should be labeled as such. This is ostensibly a news story. And it would be better, first of all, if they were honest and said, look, we like gun control. We're going to try to make a case for it. And if they did that, I think it would be more intellectually rigorous, because they would be consciously aware of the fact that they're making a case, trying to persuade people, and they would have to marshal evidence, which they completely failed to do in this article, right? So you can argue with the evidence, you could argue over their interpretation of it, but at least you then have a rational debate. But if instead it's presented as a news story about, here's what's happening in Columbus, murders are down now, but murders were up, and that's largely because the gun laws are not strong enough. That's the news,
right?
It's not an argument we're making. It's just these are the facts, right? I think that's the main problem with it. And by now, of course, I think people recognize that New York Times and other mainstream news outlets, when they do these news reports, it's not necessarily straight news, even if it's not driven by a conscious agenda. Decisions about things of what to highlight or not highlight, what to leave, what to put in, what to leave out. All those things are inevitably influenced by the bias, the pre-existing biases of the reporters and their editors. And you have to, if you're trying to write straight news, you have to be very much aware of that and still try to do a fair and balanced presentation. But if you're doing advocacy journalism, you want to try to confront your opponent's strongest arguments. You'd want to not cherry pick evidence just so it fits your theory, right? You want to be fair-minded, because how else are you going to persuade anyone? If all you want to do is preach to the choir, that's one thing. But if you're actually trying to persuade people, then you need to actually marshal some evidence and make a coherent, logical argument. And this is like the worst of both worlds, because it's ostensibly news reporting, but it's not news reporting, and as advocacy journalism, it's really bad because it's not making a case.
Right. Yeah. They didn't even pick the right case to highlight. I mean, like you said, there's no connectivity, there's no connectors between all the points that they're trying to make and the one case they're using as an example. I mean, I'm sure they could have found something that would have made a rational argument, but it was like they picked the most bizarre, weirdest case. Even gun owners are like, what the hell happened there, kind of thing. It's just like they plucked the weirdest one out of the tree and said, we'll use this one, and then failed to make any connection to any of it. It's bizarre. And I mean, at some point I have to think it's almost laziness, because they just expect people to believe them and they don't feel like they have to be justified in making those connections, which is frustrating. All right. Well, we're 15 seconds out. Jacob Sullum from Reason Magazine is our guest. We're going to talk a little bit more about this here on the other side, and we're going to be back. Continue here. Don't go anywhere. Please like and share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all the YouTube and Facebook things to get more people involved in the conversation. Here we go.
What the hell's an assault weapon?
If we could just figure out how to get all of the murder guns and the attack guns and not keep selling those to people and just sell protection guns, I think that would be great and solve a lot of problems.
Does this mean that if we hurt your feelings, you'd consider the Michael Dukes Show assault radio? Okay, we can live with that. Here's Michael Dukes.
Yep, a little bit of assault radio. Your feelings may be hurt. I mean, show me on this doll where the Michael Dukes Show hurts your feelings, because I'd really like to see. A guy who loves to hurt feelings, no, he really doesn't, but he does a good job of it, is Jacob Sullum over at Reason Magazine, senior editor. I've seen him do this several times, pick apart an article with just these fallacies, logical or otherwise, that are placed together. We're talking about an article in the New York Times that's titled, that basically blames looser gun laws for a homicide spike that's now receding. And I want to touch on one point here before we get into the journalistic aspect of this, Jacob. But again, as you mentioned, it wasn't just Columbus, Ohio that saw a spike in homicides. It was the entire country. We had been on a 35, 40-year decline on homicides across the nation, with more and more guns being purchased, by the way. We sold hundreds of millions of guns over those years. The homicides rates were on a steady decline since they started tracking them. And there was this spike during COVID, 20, 21, 22. We saw this bit of a spike. It came up. But then this year, and they even point out that, well, the homicides are generally falling, they say, yada, yada. But they weren't just generally falling. Homicides had dramatically fallen. In fact, homicides in 2024 are already at 50% or less of what they were in 2023. So again, we could see that this is kind of an aberration in the overall scheme of things as you look at that traditional trend line for the last 40 years. So it again, just the lack of integrity in pointing that out, first of all, that it was falling, and second of all, that it was a dramatic decrease from year to year.
Right. So, I mean, the thesis of this article, in addition to the argument that weak gun control creates violent crime or fosters violent crime, there is an argument that the availability of guns generally, which obviously the laws could affect, contributes to violent crime. And the more guns you have, the more violent crime you have, the more murders you're going to have. The problem with this thesis, and the way they try to back it up, is to say, well, we saw this spike in homicides during the pandemic, and there also was an increase in gun sales, which is true. Both of those things did happen.
Absolutely.
Right. But the implication is that the increase in gun sales had something to do with the increase in homicides. If that's true, if having more guns in circulation, inevitably leads to more homicides, you would have a hard time explaining the trend you were just talking about, which is that since the early 1990s, the homicide rate and the violent crime rate in general has come way down. In fact, what we're talking about in terms of the spike during the pandemic, which, by the way, didn't even exceed those levels. It was, aberrational for recent years, but it was still below the levels
in the 90s, right?
In the early 90s. So, but what we're talking about now is going back to the what they called in the Times piece, I think, the new normal, which was just assuming that homicides are going to be, substantially lower than they were in the early 1990s. That seems to be what's happening now. We're returning to that sort of new baseline, but that baseline, or that, and the very steady long decline that led to that new baseline, happened while people were buying more and more guns every year, and the number of guns in circulation was steadily increasing. So yes, during the pandemic, I think in 2020, there was something like 22 million guns sold, which was higher than the year before. It went down after that. So the Times is saying that there are many more guns in circulation and there are many fewer restrictions on them, and that must have something to do with the rise in homicides. But that's clearly doesn't hold if you look at the much longer trend since the 90s, and they never even try to grapple with that. Once you've got hundreds of millions of guns in circulation, I know you've argued about these estimates, but a couple of sources say around 400 million now. That's plenty of guns, even if
even if it's on the low end, that's a lot of guns, right?
And so even if gun sales stop tomorrow, you would not expect homicides to stop, right? There's plenty of guns to commit homicides. The real question is, what was it that happened during the pandemic that led to this spike in homicides? And to argue that it's simply that people bought more guns is just highly implausible. I mean, there are all kinds of, obviously, dislocations going on at that time, people out of work, a loss of social support, all kinds of social and economic factors that we might surmise contributed to this increase in violence. But their argument is people bought a lot more guns. Therefore, they were easier to get on the black market. They say you can get a handgun for $50 in Columbus. You might want to make a trip to Columbus.
Bring in a few $100.
It's just as easy to buy as marijuana and so on. But of course, and they're talking specifically about sales to teenagers who then turn around and kill each other over these stupid disputes. It's illegal to steal guns. They say that lots of guns are being stolen. People buy guns, therefore people who buy guns are at fault because then they can be stolen. But of course, it's illegal to steal them. It's illegal to sell them to minors. All this stuff is illegal. Has nothing to do with any changes in policy in Ohio or at the federal level. And it just doesn't pass the smell test when you make a claim that is contradicted by decades of data.
Yeah. Well, and this again is a huge. This is the huge problem of correlation not implying causation, right? And we see this time. I mean, Dr. John Lott's book, More Guns, Less Crime, it tries to do it in the other direction to say, look,
Right.
the more guns and there's less crime. And he actually, backs it up with some statistics. But you're right. There's a ton of things that could be linked to this spike in crime, whether it was the George Floyd riots, the uncertainty, police telling people, I'm sorry, we can't get to you. You're on your own. The defunding of the police movement, the lockdowns where people, had mental health crises, and there's, all the uncertainty. There was so many things that could contribute to it. But again, going back to that trend line over the last 40 or 50 years, since they've been tracking homicides, since they started tracking, that line has come down over the years. And there has been, hundreds of millions of more guns sold in that intervening time frame. So I think that kind of debunks that right from the beginning. But they just continue to cling to that to say it's only because of the guns that these things are happening, looking at none of the other factors. And I find that willful blindness, I find it fascinating.
Yeah, and more generally, in addition to looking at legislation in Ohio, they gesture toward the Supreme Court and the decision in Bruin, saying, this is obviously bad for public safety, and it meant that we couldn't have as much gun control. But you really have to get specific, right? When you're saying something like that, what do you mean? Exactly which laws are not allowed anymore that were allowed before, and exactly how are those related to the gun violence that you're talking about, right? So if you're talking about something like what actually was at issue in that case, which is, how do you get permission from the government to carry arms for self-defense in public? The Supreme Court said, it's not okay to give government officials broad discretion to decide who has a good enough reason. It is okay to say you have to meet these objective criteria, and if you do, then you get a permit. Is that at all plausibly related to generally rising homicides during the pandemic or anytime else in any particular place? Only if you assume that these newly licensed gun owners are the people driving this crime wave, right? Well, is that true? Can you give me some examples, right? When we know that if you look at the data, that the people who actually jump through the hoops to get these permits tend to be much more law-abiding than the average person, and it makes sense because they're the people who are willing to do that. They're trying to comply with the law, right? So if you're willing to go through that process, it suggests you're generally law-abiding, and in fact, the data on arrests, bear that out.
They show that they're more law-abiding than police officers. The concealed carry permit holders are arrested at a lower rate than police officers. That's pretty low. I mean, that pretty much shows you that they're the good guys in this scenario. And as you pointed out, there's already laws against doing all the things that we've talked about: by stealing guns, selling stolen merchandise, selling to kids, killing people, robbing. All those things are already illegal. How is the one more law going to stop them?
Right. If I were a reporter at the New York Times, I suppose I would have picked a better opening anecdote. If they can find a case, and I'm sure that this happens from time to time, that people with permits do get arrested, right? They lose their permits because they commit some crime. Find a case like that. Open with that at least, and then you can say, well, assuming it happened, after Ohio eliminated the permit requirement, if somebody was carrying a gun and who would otherwise not be carrying a gun, and he got into some kind of argument and it escalated and he killed somebody without justification, right? That's the kind of case you want to say it's too easy for people to carry guns in public. Now, one thing about Ohio, by the way, is one of the arguments for eliminating the permit requirement for concealed carry is that you already could carry openly without a permit. So that doesn't really make much sense, right? I mean,
right.
In other words, in effect, people already could carry guns. It had to be open, not concealed. So you wouldn't, on the face of it, expect that to have much impact, except in particular cases where people, who are legally carrying guns get involved in arguments that escalate. And it's not that it never happens, but that is not representative of homicides in Columbus or anywhere else. It's not typical.
It's a frustrating situation, and if you'll stick with us for one final segment here, Jacob, I want to get into the ramifications of. I wanted to get into it this one, but we kind of. I love it. I love these kind of discussions. This is why long form is important, folks. Let me just put it that way. But I want to talk about the ramifications on journalism as a whole, because it's not just guns that are being talked about this way. It's not just. It's all kinds of issues, and we see this time and time. We're focusing on guns today, but this happens all over the place. And like I said, I've seen Jacob and other writers at places like Reason dissect these things and come back with them and say, well, wait a second, this, that doesn't make any sense. So let's continue with this here in just a moment. Jacob Sullum, senior editor, Reason Magazine, our guest. The Michael Duke Show continues. Common sense, liberty-based, free thinking radio. We're back with more right after this.
We're broadcasting live through a series of tubes.
Allowing all of these entities to provide streaming stuff going on the internet.
Well, it's kind of hard to explain. Sorry. Streaming live every weekday morning on Facebook Live and MichaelDukesShow.com.
Jacob Sullum, Reason Magazine, continues with us here. It is amazing to see the mental gymnastics that are required by some people to try and jump through this. Like you said, it wasn't even an attempt in reading this article. The more I read it, the more I was scratching my head. There wasn't even an attempt to create connections between the main thrust of their argument and the examples. But we see this all the time, right? Somebody goes on a shooting spree, and the president gets up there or some other talking head from some political party and says, well, this is just another reason why we need, assault weapons bans. And then it turns out that the shooter was using pistols, or this is another reason why we need, high capacity, standard capacity magazine bans. And it turns out that the shooter had, 15 magazines that were all 10 rounds or whatever, like the Virginia Tech shooter. I mean, it doesn't matter. It's like we're crafting a narrative before we even know what's going on in that regard.
Yeah, and one other example of that, which is probably even more common, is this is why we need universal background checks. And it turns out that the perpetrator passed a background check.
Yep.
Did not have a disqualifying record, which is typical. Now, some people do, but that's a minority of mass shooters who are actually legally disqualified. And even among the people who are legally disqualified, which includes, teenagers, sometimes they're not legally allowed to buy the guns. They get them through an informal source that would not be affected. So if you steal a gun from your parents, that is not the sort of situation where a new background check requirement would have mattered. You're not supposed to be buying it. You're too young to buy it anyway. So
exactly.
So you have to, and I think that's fair. Look, if you're citing this horrendous crime that's in the news as a justification for a particular policy, at the very least, there should be some plausible connections between the details of that crime and the policy that you're proposing. I don't think that's, unreasonable. You can't just say there's violence. Obviously, we need more gun control. I mean, that's basically what the New York Times does in this story, right? There's violence. Obviously, we need more gun control. But you really have to be a little more specific than that in order to construct a plausible argument.
Right. Well, then you have to start asking questions like, the composition and the demographics of things like, for example, homicide, even during the spike during the pandemic, and you look at it and you figure out what's the breakdown. Is this random violence? Is it criminal on criminal violence? Is it, what is the demographic breakdown of those? And you're finding out more and more that a lot of this homicide is, again, is between criminal elements already. So how is one more law going to stop criminals from being criminals and then killing each other, and then again penalizing the 99.00006% of law-abiding gun owners for the 0.0006% that are actually creating and breaking the law? That is the baby with the bathwater thing.
Yeah, I mean, we mentioned mass killers, but this is just a tiny fraction of gun homicides. For run-of-the-mill criminals, the ones who don't get as much attention, the sources are primarily informal. So whereas the typical mass killer actually can buy a gun over the counter at a gun store because he doesn't have a disqualifying record, the typical criminal probably is legally disqualified from buying the gun, but he can get one anyway. If you look at survey data on where did you get your guns, they give you a list of the places where they get them, and it is rarely I went into a gun store and bought it. And if they did succeed in doing that, that means they did pass a background check. They might get somebody else to buy it for them. That's illegal too. Or more likely they get it through informal sources like theft, like friends and acquaintances, like the black market. These people are not going to be following new laws. When you say it's already illegal, for example, to sell to somebody if you know he has a felony record. And if people are already doing that, if you tell them, oh, you got to do a background check, you got to, they're probably not going to follow that new rule. So that's really, you have to consider what the policy actually would require, how likely it is that it'll be obeyed, and how likely it is that it would be effective given how criminals typically get guns nowadays.
Yeah, it's frustrating to watch, and again, the mainstream narrative and it doesn't matter what station. I still remember the Sutherland Springs shooting in Texas, where some talking head on Fox, Greg Jarrett or somebody, got up and started spouting absolute nonsense. I mean, this is supposedly the conservative news media outlet, and yet even their talking heads just start espousing things that they have no knowledge of, putting out false information and saying it with passion and fervor and making people believe it, and just passing this information off like it's real. And that's also part of my problem here, talking about things of which they know nothing. And it's again one of the reasons why Firearms Friday was born back in the day, is because I got tired of seeing this over and over and over again, and we're trying to demystify and fight back against some of that misinformation. All right, Jacob Sullum, Reason Magazine, is our guest. We're continuing one final segment, The Michael Dukes Show, common sense, liberty-based, free thinking radio.
What the hell's an assault weapon? What isn't? If I assault you with a penguin, doesn't that make it an assault weapon? Does this mean that if we hurt your feelings, you'd consider the Michael Dukes Show assault radio? Okay, we can live with that. Here's Michael Dukes.
Those assault penguins, man, you do not want to get in a phone booth with an assault penguin. It is a bad deal. It's a bad day for you. Although they do taste like chicken. It's an interesting thing. All right, let's continue on. Jacob Sullum, Reason Magazine, our guest, senior editor over there. We've been talking about one of his latest pieces. He's prolific. You've written like 3 articles since this article came out 2 or 3 days ago. But this latest article talking about the New York Times and how they implausibly blame looser gun laws on a homicide spike in Ohio. And this leads to the bigger question of journalism as a whole. I referenced the Scripps story earlier, but there are many stories where we're seeing this, and some of it's, I'm sure, editorial. Some of it is the editor, maybe not the person who wrote the article, but the editor writes the headline, the person writes the article, and there may be no connectivity between what the headline says and the stuff in the article. But we're seeing this more and more. We're seeing this ideation of, we want to put forward a specific idea, we mark it in the headlines, and then we never back up those statements or those demands or those questions in the body of the story. And part of this is because statistically, I'm sure that there's probably statistics out there to show that most people probably don't read the whole article. They read the headline, the subheading, and maybe the first paragraph or two, but they never read through the whole thing. And so we're getting to that point where more and more of this is happening, Jake. But what does that say about journalism in America? And what does it say about people like you who are advocate journalists, but also are out there deconstructing some of these arguments?
Well, I would say the problem that you described where the headlines are misleading, that happens a lot, especially with reports on scientific studies. Even with the headlines on the press releases from universities about the studies, those are often misleading. And if you go and look at the study itself, you can see how it's wrong. That was not the case with this New York Times article, though. The headline and the subhead were perfectly consistent with the thrust of the article, with what the two people, the two reporters, were arguing. And this is part of the problem, is that this is presented as a news story, but they're is essentially advocating for a particular point of view, which is that gun control is good and will help reduce violent crime. But because they couch it as a news story, it's like, these are the facts. Homicide went up in Columbus. Loose gun laws had a lot to do with that. We don't even have to bother to explain why or how that happened, because it's just a fact. So that's obviously misleading. If this were presented explicitly as advocacy journalism, if they're explicitly setting out to persuade you of a particular policy position, then I think it would have been a better article, because then they would have said, maybe you have your reservations about gun control, but let me show you how it can make a difference in cities plagued by violence. Or let me show you, or maybe you think it's no big deal when they loosen these gun laws, but in fact, it can be really bad, and here's how. If they had tried to make that case, then at least they would have had to be forthright and explicit about it, and they would have had to marshal some evidence and make something like a logical argument. In this case,
honest, yeah,
in this case, you have the worst of both worlds, because it's ostensibly a news story, but it's not a news story. It's really a piece of advocacy, but as a piece of advocacy, it's really bad, because it's not grappling in any serious way with the issues or the evidence,
right.
not even trying to formulate a logical argument. Not confronting contrary evidence. They're not even supplying evidence in favor of their views. So they're not confronting the contrary evidence. So I would have no problem with, a newspaper that has a certain point of view, where people understand that it has a certain point of view, but at least when they set out to promote whatever their agenda is, they're honest about it, and they try to be intellectually rigorous. If you just want to preach to the choir, that's fine. That's one thing. But if you're actually trying to persuade people, then you do have to present evidence. You do have to make a logical argument. So maybe that's not what they're doing at the New York Times. Maybe they are just catering to what they take to be their readers' prejudices. If so, I think they're doing a fine job of that, right? And they got a very big circulation, so maybe they don't feel like they have to change that model. But it does offend me when people are doing advocacy in the guise of news reporting.
Right.
Not that there's anything wrong with advocacy, but just that you should label it as such, and you should do it in a serious way, not in this kind of half-ass thing where you let the headline and the subhead and the lead do all the work without actually supplying any evidence.
Right. Well, the New York Times is kind of, even Elon Musk dropped something on Twitter yesterday, or on X, I guess, where he screenshotted the headline. What's the latest headline on the New York Times? Something about, looking at the racial bias of basically photography or something. And at this point, he's just like, they've walked off the deep end at this point, where they're trying to, it's all about advocacy, and yet again, portraying themselves as a non-biased, balanced news outlet. That's not happening anymore. Really, nobody is buying that. Maybe the masses, maybe people who are just really not paying attention and could care less, are again hitting the bullet points and the slug on the top, and then they're like, oh, well, that's the story and that's what's going on. But there seems to be a lack of this non-biased journalism going on anymore. It's either advocacy headlined as advocacy, or it's advocacy subterfuged as news. And like you said, that's the bigger problem here.
Yeah, and I think, I don't think there's any such thing as totally unbiased or totally objective journalism, because we're all human beings. We all have our biases. Even if we're not aware of it, those biases may affect the way we report a story. But at least there is this ideal with that, when you're doing a news story, that you play it straight, you give both sides. I hate to use fair and balanced, because that's kind of that slogan has been really dragged through the mud. But yes, you try to be fair and balanced. If that's what you're doing, if you're doing a straight news report, you're reporting on a controversy. Here's what the two sides say. And you sum it up in a fair way, without putting your thumb on the scale, right? And that's a very worthwhile model of journalism. It is not often delivered by the New York Times. Sometimes it is,
right?
But oftentimes, what is ostensibly news reporting is actually opinion or advocacy, but not labeled as such.
Right. Well, but even good advocacy would still be fair and balanced in terms of bringing up the counter narrative to then pick it apart, right? I mean, that would be the thing. You'd want to bring
it's right.
Go ahead.
Obviously, you're trying to persuade somebody of a particular point of view, but in order to do that, you have to say, here's what my opponents will say, and you try to give their strongest arguments, and here's why I think they're wrong. Right? But if it's presented as just the truth as a news story, there are no opponents, right? You don't. There's no contrary evidence. There's not even in this case any evidence on your side. It's just assertion.
Yeah. It's not
pure
even
assertion.
Yeah, it's not even a cohesive argument at that point. It's not even. It's just not even it. We're running out of time here, Jacob. What else are you working on? What should folks be looking out for you over the weekend or coming up next week? What should they be looking for from you?
Well, not anytime real soon, but I am. Actually, there will be. So I'm working on this book about the parallels between drug control and gun control. And I had a piece which is very good, I think, in a recent issue of Reason about the roots of the anti-opium campaign, this is the beginnings of the war on drugs in the late 19th century.
Right.
And how this was, very much rooted in animus against Chinese immigrants. So I just try to tell that story. That's based on research I did for the book. And there's another story that'll be coming out in Reason in an upcoming issue that looks at the constitutional justification for federal gun and drug laws, why these were very controversial initially, but how over the years, people just take it for granted that this is the federal government's business to regulate intrastate activities, even if it's not even commercial, but definitely doesn't cross, doesn't go between states, doesn't cross state boundaries. Still, somehow this is considered to be something Congress can regulate under the Interstate Commerce Clause. And that basically has become an all-purpose excuse for federal legislation. And so this is an illustration with gun laws and drug laws of how that played out, where initially they had to be disguised as something else, as revenue measures.
Right.
And then once the concept of what you could regulate under the Commerce Clause expanded, thanks to the Supreme Court, that became no longer necessary. And you could just say something about interstate commerce and you're good to go.
No, it's the 1934 U.S. v. Miller argument all over again, and the passage of the NFA, how they had handguns in it, but they knew it was so controversial they couldn't do it. They knew they couldn't regulate guns, so they did it as an argument for taxation. Again, the revenue measure. That's how the NFA tax stamp situation came about. It's pretty amazing. I can't wait to read it. Jacob Sullum, senior editor, Reason Magazine. Jacob, hope you have a great Memorial Day weekend. Thanks for coming on board this today. I appreciate that.
You too. Thank you.
All right, folks, we're out of time. We got more coming up next week, Tuesday. Have a great weekend. Enjoy yourself. Be kind. Love one another. Live well. The Michael Duke Show. Common sense, liberty-based, free thinking radio. Don't forget to go check out AlaskaRadioAuction.com before tomorrow morning. Get those bids in. We'll see you then, folks. Have a great day. All right, final thoughts. We'll give Jacob one final bite at the apple because he stuck around here with us and has done such a good job. I appreciate it, my friend. I said you're doing yeoman's work out there, and I think we should be doing more and more of these articles where we pick apart these arguments and just say, how stupid is this argument that you're making? But I'll give you final thoughts here before I let you go.
Well, I feel like I should have been promoted from yeoman by now.
Yeah.
Given the number of years, I don't know. I remember on Star Trek, the yeoman was the woman in the short skirt who brought Captain Kirk his coffee. And I feel
at least you're not wearing a red shirt. That's all I'm saying.
I shouldn't be bringing people coffee anymore.
Yeah. So he's doing commander's work now, or at least
I would not look good in that skirt either. But yeah. So I was just wondering that the thing. We may have discussed this before, but your reference to assault penguins, is that a Monty Python reference?
No, it was just something that we came up with.
That's an actual thing.
Oh, is it?
In the world of Monty Python, there were exploding penguin statues on the top of TV sets. They would just explode spontaneously. So to weaponize it, you need to have more precise control over when the penguin explodes. It can't just be randomly because that's no good, right? But they had the general idea before you did, I think. Of
yeah, well, that's funny. Maybe it was subliminally, because I remember that now that you mention it. Maybe it was subliminally running in my mind when I wrote all those scripts, because I was just like, what's the most ridiculous thing I can think about? A penguin, an assault penguin. Yeah, so that's what it is. But I mean, that's the argument is, anything could be, the assault hammer, the assault pencil, the assault whatever. I get so sick and tired of that. And, of course, assault radio, because we offended you and now your feelings are hurt. But yeah, that's funny. I hadn't even thought about that. I haven't thought about that for years until you
should watch it again.
I should. Well, anything with Monty Python, you could enjoy a lot of good, Have You Been Served? Was that the other one? And Faulty Towers. And there's a lot of good British humor out there, but Monty Python is the king of the heap as far as those. As far as that goes. Any final thoughts? Are we good to go?
No, I'm out of thoughts.
All right. Well, good.
I don't know what I'm going to write about now. You've exhausted my thoughts.
Well, I can't wait to read this book, quite honestly, because the parallels between the drug prohibition and gun prohibition, I've seen a few of them and seen a few arguments that revolve around that, but it is fascinating. And like you said, when these things were first brought up, and I'm going back to the NFA, the National Firearms Act, the Congress was they were a democratically controlled Congress and presidency at the time, and yet they still had to fight tooth and nail to get it across because they admitted they did not have the power to regulate firearms. So instead, they justified it by saying it's a revenue measure by taxing them. So it's not a regulation, it's a tax. But it's become, over the years, like you said, it's just become commonplace, and now everybody takes it for granted. And that's the problem. It's the drip, drip, frog in a pot thing.
Yeah, and it was the same thing with the drug laws. That's why it's the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, the Marijuana Tax Act. These were not officially bans, even though in effect they were bans. And the one thing that is, I don't know, it's not encouraging. It's kind of startling to go and look at the congressional record from when these laws were passed, and people in Congress actually argued over whether they had the authority to pass legislation back then. So
today they're like, we can do anything we want.
When they banned the importation of opium for smoking, it wasn't a majority, but there were several legislators who's like, I hate opium as much as the next guy, but I don't see how Congress has the authority to do this. And I know you're saying it's a revenue measure, but it's not really a revenue measure. Really, you're trying to exercise a police power that the federal government does not have. That power is reserved to the states under the Constitution. So you just can't do this. So that is like so refreshing compared to what happens nowadays, where you have somebody who actually favors the policy. He's like, if I could stamp out opium smoking, I would do it. But unfortunately, Congress does not have that authority. You almost never hear politicians say such things nowadays.
Right. No, they automatically assume that they have the power to do all those things. And the American people, because many of them are not educated on the history of the nation or how our civic systems work, they just, like you said, they nod and they take it for granted. Of course, Congress has that power. And they don't. I mean, even the NFA is still a revenue measure. It's not anyway, it's frustrating to watch. The most irritating, what was the thing? Something about the people who understand history, the most irritating things about, repeating itself because we saw it coming kind of thing or whatever, because we understood that that's where it is. So I can't wait to read the book. I hope, when is it coming out, do you think?
It'll be next year.
The
manuscript's due September. So
okay, all right. Well, we hope we'll definitely have you back on to discuss it at great length at that time, and we'll see if we can get you some sales from this little podunk state out here hanging off the middle of Canada. And we appreciate
that. Would be cool. Thank you.
Good, cool. All right. Well, Jacob, I really hope you have a good weekend. Tell your kid congratulations on graduating, and I hope you have a good time here over the holidays. Thank you for being part of it today.
Thanks. Take care.
All right. Jacob Sullum, Reason Magazine, our guest. And that brings us to the end for this week. Yeah, this week. All right. We are, we're out of here. We're ready to go. Going to take off. Fly, be free. Don't forget, if you want to help support the show, Patreon. That's a good way to do it. You can support us over there. For the cost of a cup of coffee a month, you can help keep the lights on in here. These lights are expensive. Not really, but you know what I mean. Help support the show, get access to the Facebook group, and so much more. We appreciate you guys coming in and being part of it. I hope you have a great weekend, whether it's a 2-day or a 3-day or a 4-day. Enjoy yourselves. Spend time with your fam. Think of the reason why we got Memorial Day. And we'll be back at it again next Tuesday. The Michael Dukes Show, Common Sense Radio. See ya.
We've shed our terrestrial radio skin, and now we are slimy lizard internet people. It's the Michael Dukes Show.
Thank you.